Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to present at the Albany Sandplain Forum, and apologies I can't be with you. I'm going to move on from some of the presentations you've heard in the last day or so about groundwater and take that into a discussion around opportunities for developing some businesses and add-ons while also trying to make the best of the environment and preventing some of the damages that occurs through excess water and also through excess saline water. I think what we all understand is agriculture over the last 5 to 10 years is coping with a large amount of variability. We've come through 3 very dry seasons now, fantastically into 2 very wet seasons, but that's a bit of a glimpse about what the future has for us. And I think looking from an agricultural perspective, the last 3 dry seasons set a lot of issues in motion in terms of poor water security and in terms of environmental consequences. But interestingly, the salinity processes that you've heard John talk about earlier have continued on. So we've got the opportunity to look at some new and improved water supply options, some industry risk management. And I think the goal is to look at some of those opportunities around that excess water and think about some of the value adding that it creates and also some of the protective opportunities you have from valuing that water. So agriculture at its largest level, and I'm talking about the whole of the southwest at this scale at the moment, we use a large amount for spray technologies, both weed control and also nutrient management. We have a large industry around meat processing and development of feedlots and similar that use a significant amount, and with piggeries, with chooks and similar feedlots, that industry is growing, and also that concentration of animals and post-processing is growing against a background of broadacre livestock. One of the problems with our 2 dominant water supply options, which is both surface water and also the integrated scheme, which doesn't go as far south as the Stirlings and most of the Sandplain, is that it's highly exposed to risks, as we saw in those 3 dry years, particularly from evaporation and also just the sheer cost of trying to run the scale of supplying many gigalitres across the Great Southern Town Water Scheme, and also at a fairly significant cost. So in the last 18 months, we've put together a project called Water Smart Farms. It's driven by a couple of core investments. The first one's looking for groundwater, and then value adding that groundwater with basically a breakthrough technology, even though it's an old technology, but a breakthrough technology using reverse osmosis desalination. In addition to that, the project's looking at surface water and capturing and managing surface water in an appropriate way to support the industries I've just talked about. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus rather than on the collective Water Smart Farms work and about the agriculture in more general, I'm going to focus a little bit more about desalination and groundwater. So if we go back and look at desal, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen around about 50 units delivered across the wheat belt from about 6 suppliers, and that's growing, across a broad spectrum of agriculture. But as you can see by the diagram, focusing in the south and focusing essentially where the integrated water supply options are not present. And slowly that development was drifting into the South Coast, and we had many requests for information in the last 18 months for desalination across the South Coast itself. We've got 4 trial units going in place at the moment, including an agriculture school over near Esperance and some rural towns being implemented this summer. I'll just give you a little example before I head into the Albany Sandplain in particular. This is a grower north near east of Katanning, sorry. He's got 11,000 pigs. He's using an RO plant, which is a very new concept of an RO system. A lot of this is taking place below the water table in a large production bore. And that RO plant is feeding 70,000 litres of fresh water from an aquifer of about 14,500 milligrams per litre, so a bit less than half seawater, and rejecting that water or the wastewater from that system, which is about 50% or a bit over, into a deep fractured rock aquifer which sits in and under that farm. The site is the dot in the middle of the diagram where you can see a roughly east-west fault line which we're exploring as a water supply system. But in the South Coast, we don't have to worry so much about the fractured rock and the deep aquifers because you've got the Albany Sandplain sequence. What you also have is a legacy of a lot of Landcare drilling, a lot of investigations, and also some relatively recent mining work that Peter de Brockett and others would have talked to you a little bit about. So we're capitalising on a wealth of groundwater monitoring and some modern geology and some descriptions of some of those aquifers. Okay, so the other thing we look at is the distribution of that groundwater system, and we note particularly on the Albany Sandplain, but also across the wheat belt, a trend in groundwater levels that is still largely rising. Now, from a resources perspective, a lot of the conversations across the state, and particularly as a consequence of drying conditions in the last 20 years, that hasn't been the case. And in fact, on the coastal plain, a large part of the groundwater resources that the major water agencies manage have a falling level. That's not true of the cleared wheat belt, and that's not true of the Albany Sandplain. Of those many bores you saw before, you can see that those red triangles that we monitor and have monitored, as you can see there, for over 30 years, show a continuing rate of groundwater rise, with occasional bores, and these are the yellow ones, that have a fall, and some that are relatively stable. But in essence, just short of 40 to 50% of the bores that we monitor, and in the Albany Sandplain as well, have that slow rising trend where they're not near seepage areas and large incised streams like the Pallinup. So let's look at the consequence of having an aquifer, as you've seen previously, and a groundwater resource that's still in development. I just want to focus on an area that Peter de Brockett would have talked about and the South Down project, because there's good groundwater hydraulics and it gives us a bit of a springboard to think about where these aquifers are. This is a large wetland suite south of the Stirlings in the Wellstead area, and as said previously, this data comes out of a Stratogen report that Peter may have covered. Apologies if he's done that and I haven't seen it. But you have a blanket of sandplain and sediments overlying what is an aquifer system trenched in to the weathered bedrock at the basement. And overlying that and underpinning that sandplain sequence are these broad sheets of sand. This is a surface cover map, not like the topography that you just saw, but of the sandplain that drapes over the entire Albany sequence and the Bremer sequence. And this is from an app that we use when we're doing farm investigations. You can see the player lakes around the edge of the Stirlings, and you can see the dune fields and those large eastward and south-southeastward trending dunes that cover that landscape and those aquifers underneath. So as would have been described, the aquifers sit in the form of the Pallinup and Werrilup formations, and they sit in those paleodrainage deposits that lie across the Bremer system. I think of interest to us and the interest of ag development and the work that's been done relatively recently through projects such as this, we're seeing that both the Pallinup and particularly the Werrilup contain water resources that are able to produce of the order of 1 to 10 litres a second, of groundwater salinities of 5 to 20,000 milligrams per litre. Now, that sort of salinity is well and truly within the ability of RO desalinators to manage. And on the basis of a 50% extraction rate, we look at that as an opportunity to develop scales of agriculture at farm level, which depends on 10 to 20 kilolitres per day, at feedlot level, which depends on 100 to 300 kilolitres a day, and potentially even larger than that if the aquifer is extensive and the tests suggest that they can cope with those sorts of withdrawals. I want to finish my presentation just recognising the time limits with a couple of conversation starters and also conclusions. I think one of the conversations that Don asked of me was, and you've heard previously, are there reliable aquifers and water supplies that can support agriculture? And even if they're saline, new industries and across challenging years. And I think where the Werrilup and Pallinup are available, that certainly seems to be the case. And that's an extensive suite of aquifers across the South Coast. The desalination of groundwater is now possible. There is clearly farmers that are implementing at quite different scales. And as I've shown you just briefly, up to 100 kilolitres a day is well within the scope of agricultural systems. And 300 to 400 kilolitres a day has been considered by growers and some industry processors. The opportunity for RO to feed medium agribusiness and allied processing exists, as we've just described. Reducing pressure in some of these aquifers means that it takes away some of the risks to surface water resources from groundwater discharge, particularly in the wetland systems. It has the opportunity to reduce the extent of salinity from where that systems takes place. And as I've just noted here, it provides some diversified local economies and some value-adding industries. I think one of the particular issues with RO desalination is the ability and need to manage the reject waters. And some of the brine systems that exist deep in the Werrilup and in the coastal portions of the Werrilup, and potentially even in some of the really saline groundwater flows that take place in the Pallinup, which is regularly over 30,000 milligrams per litre, we probably have the opportunity with salt lakes and other disposal environments to manage the rejected water and also create the opportunity. So Don, thanks for the opportunity to present. I hope what I've been able to do is describe a breakthrough technology that offers a chance to not only reduce the amount of groundwater causing land degradation, but also provide a feed source and value add opportunity for industries to grow on the South Coast. Thank you.